Good morning, everyone. Good evening, wherever you are in the world. Professor Barbato is in Germany, early morning. I'm in India, also morning time. So welcome, Dr. Barbato. And it's our privilege and honor to have you all the way from Germany, Hungary, Europe, broadly, for this webinar. And let me read your bio, and then I'll invite you to present your great topic today. So, Professor Melanie Barbato works on interreligious dialogue, religious diplomacy, and the communicative negotiation of religious identity. She is a lecturer at RWTH Aachen University, Germany, and coordinates the network of Hinduism in Dialogue based on the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, UK. She is an associate editor with Cross Currents, UNC Press in the US, and a member of the G20 Interfaith Forum on Religion and Environment Working Group. She is the author of Jain Approaches to Plurality, Identity as Dialogue, and currently co-edits a book called Jainism and Comparative Theology, a multi-religious perspective. She holds degrees from LMU Munich, the University of Oxford, Stirling University, and Merivale College, and before coming to Aachen, taught at Pacifica Communities University in Fiji. Really worldwide career, ranging from continent to continent to continent. Most welcome, Dr. Barbato, all yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Let me start maybe by sharing my presentation.
Sure. All good.
Can you see this move also?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much. My topic is interreligious studies from an Indian vantage point. And I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak on this topic in your online series. I'm really happy to be here. And I will start with a few sentences about my choice of title, Interreligious Studies from an Indian Vantage Point, because I'm obviously not Indian. And also I'm not claiming to speak from an Indian perspective, but rather I have chosen this topic to highlight the importance of the Indian context for the academic field of interreligious studies. And I'm very grateful for this format you are hosting, because some viewers might already work in exactly this field that I'm looking at, but maybe without thinking of it in terms of interreligious studies, which is a quite new and growing field. So it's about calling that perspective in the Indian context to mind. A few words about myself and how I got involved with that topic. From early on in my academic work, I studied the Indian traditions, first Hinduism for my bachelor and master, and then Jainism for my doctorate. Through that work, I began to feel that the study of religion might look different if the story was told through Indian categories rather than mainly through European categories. For example, for my bachelor, I did a 2-subject degree, so equally philosophy and religious studies. I was lucky to learn about Hinduism as an undergraduate from Gavin Flood, who is a very respected scholar in the course. And so Hinduism became, from my earliest times of being a bachelor student, my main interest of study. And I learned about Nyaya logic in that way as an undergraduate student at the same time that in the philosophy section of my degree, I had to take a course on Western logic. So for me, one system was not more natural than the other. I just found that they presented logic or reasoning in different contexts, and both Western logic and Indian logic made perfect sense within their context. And also at the same university, that was the University of Stirling, there was Timothy Fitzgerald, who is one of the key figures in critical religion. Critical religion is the academic field that looks closely at categories related to religion, like even the term religion itself, and how that is constructed, particularly in the way that it reflects power and also particular interests. Such as, for example, the distinction between a private realm of religion versus a public realm of politics. The argument of critical religion is that these concepts are often co-constructed so that they support one another. And I learned from Timothy Fitzgerald, that expert in critical religion, my basic education on Buddhism, because he had developed his ideas from the time he spent in India and also the time he spent in Japan. And he explained how different religious belonging and participation works, for example, in Japan or maybe in Asian countries compared to European countries. So from him, I learned how problematic labels like religion can be and how inadequate many of the standard academic terms and containers are for the Indian context. Later, I moved more into interreligious studies, and all these forms of shaping my academic path were still in the back of my mind. But I also developed another thought, namely that India has a very long history of debate and engagement between different traditions, and that actually one could tell a history of interreligious dialogue without mentioning Europe or America for many centuries. And I think if we take the Indian perspective, interaction between people who believe or who do different things, that is just the normal in India, probably since millennia, because the subcontinent is such a culturally rich area. So in a way, it's a very different kind of what the normal experience was from people compared to, for example, the areas in Europe that were until recently fairly homogeneous in religious terms, such as some regions in Bavaria, where I grew up, Bavaria in Germany. So this led me to ask, what changes if India is not just an object of interreligious studies, but the vantage point from which we approach the field? So what would change if the normal point of reference would be Hinduism or Jainism and not Western Christianity, even though this is my own family background? And this is what I'm working on right now. So what I'm presenting is still a work in progress in a way, or an open question or a goal and vision, but I will explore some initial points for how we can reflect on these, and I will explore the topic first historically and then conceptually. One point is that history is not simple out there. That's something that I learned from critical religion, that we tend sometimes to treat words as if they would match one-to-one to realities that are outside in the world. And history is also often treated as if it was simply the story of what happened, like a sum of facts as events in the past. Jan Assmann, who was himself an Egyptologist, argues that history is created through what he calls the semiotization of time. And semiotics is the study of signs and symbols, and semiotization could be defined as the process of how we turn, say, a small doodle or drawing into a symbol by ascribing meaning. And by semiotization of time, Assmann means that we give meaning to the past by selecting events and connecting them into a coherent narrative. He writes that only a meaningful past is remembered, and only a remembered past becomes meaningful. So Assmann has worked a lot on what he calls cultural memory, and he sees memory itself as an act of meaning making. So when we describe something, for example, as an important event or a turning point or an origin, we are already interpreting and assigning meaning by selecting, by highlighting, by connecting, and by foregrounding and backgrounding. So what finds its way into history books is not simply history as something out there, but a group effort that consists of many such meaning-making processes. And if history is not straightforward, then there can be multiple possible trajectories that could lead to the same event. And the Western story is only one version from one perspective. In itself, I would say this is neither good nor bad, but the problem obviously is that for a long time, Western trajectories were presented as universal for obvious reasons that have to do with power dynamics and cultural hegemony. So Dipesh Chakrabarty's famous book, Provincializing Europe, Post-Colonial Thought and Historical Difference, discusses the myth of Europe as the original site of modernity and how this myth is ingrained in academia and in the social sciences. There has, over the last years, been a lot of discussion about decolonizing academia and what that is meant to mean. For example, what vocabulary or strategies or ways of speaking would be adequate for doing better. And my last stop for work before I took my current position in Aachen was in Fiji. And there a term that was used sometimes was indigenization. And I know that these terms are contested, but the thought of it, I think it's quite meaningful that if we talk about post-colonial, it's still centering the West, even if in like a negative way. But the idea of indigenization is to shift the focus of the story on the people of the region and their telling of the story. And that is then called restoring, basically telling an alternative story about the same kind of events. If the task is to provincialize Europe, then this does not necessarily have to mean in a hostile way, but to correct a distortion that is there in many mental maps. And this is for me more universal than a post-colonial approach, and a task that I think all sides should be interested in, because it is about cherishing complexity and the complexity of truth, which I think should be the primary language of all of academia. And yeah, in that Indian context, such a complexity-oriented approach can go back to rational reasoning much further than a post-colonial scholarship. Jain philosophy offers the idea of anekantavada, the many-sidedness of reality. It states that reality is characterized by infinitely many properties, while our language is only limited. So we cannot express all these properties at the same time, or probably ever. And a related teaching, Nayavada, states that each statement expresses a particular standpoint, or Naya. And while many statements can be justified, no single perspective covers the whole truth. This, importantly, is not relativism. It doesn't mean that everything is equal, and we can still discern between true and false. But it means that the truth is larger than any one perspective, and also larger than the statements that can be made from one perspective. So we can apply this idea to historiography. For a global phenomenon like interreligious studies, the Western story of how interreligious dialogue came into being is one valid perspective, but one perspective among others. And if we look at interreligious dialogue events, then we see that a perspective that should not be missing is that of India. The Parliament of the World's Religions that was held in Chicago 1893 is often cited as the starting point for interreligious dialogue, or at least at the oldest formal format. It was an event organized by progressive American Christians, and it took progress in continuation of the discovery of the New World as the idea for connecting that to also religious progress. So the progress of the United States that was assumed to have started 400 years ago, 1493, and to reflect that in that celebration of the 400-year anniversary, with also a progressive meeting of religious voices that could show the way into a new era. So the event aimed to bring together an alliance of thinkers from traditions that were fit for modernity, and not all religious traditions were considered to be a match for that. So, for example, there were no Native American representations, but a significant number of Indians. So in some sense, the whole framing of the event was firmly part of Western and colonial history. But when we look at the people who actually make a big impression at the parliament, then a different image emerges. So I stated there was a strong Indian presence at the parliament, notably Virchand Gandhi for Jainism and Swami Vivekananda for Hinduism. And they got a lot of media attention. These men were not just invited guests. They came with their own agenda that had developed in India through many centuries of interaction between different groups that was including, but in no way limited to the British and the Americans. To these Indians, the event was not just an optional exercise, but a chance to speak about their traditions and culture as equals, well knowing that many of the hosts would see them maybe as potential collaborators, but not as equals. Let us look at the famous opening speech by Swami Vivekananda, where he states, "Sisters and brothers of America, it fills my heart with joy unspeakable to rise in response to the warm and cordial welcome which you have given us. I thank you in the name of the most ancient order of monks in the world. I thank you in the name of the mother of religions. And I thank you in the name of the millions and millions of Hindu people, all classes and sects. My thanks also to some of the speakers on the platform who, referring to delegates from the Orient, have told you that these men from far-off nations may well claim the honor of bearing to different lands the idea of toleration. I'm proud to belong to a religion which was taught the world both tolerance and universal acceptance. We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true. I'm proud to belong to a nation which has sheltered the persecuted and the refugees of all religions and all nations of the earth. I'm proud to tell you that we have gathered in our bosom the purest remnant of the Israelites who came to the southern India and took refuge with us in the very year in which the Holy Temple was shattered to pieces by Roman tyranny." This speech presents India, not the West, as the country of origin for interreligious dialogue, or even the mother of religions. Vivekananda speaking presents the context as the oldest order of monks, the origin of harmonious interreligious relations, interreligious tolerance, pluralism, and religious freedom. And he also inverses the host and guest dynamics by pointing out that India gave refuge to the Israelites as religious refugees. This presentation was a big success that has shaped the perception of Hinduism in the West up to today, actually. And there were lecture tours arranged after these presentations that continued to communicate to the public in the US. And similarly, Virchand Gandhi connected at the Parliament of Religions interreligious dialogue to the centuries of teaching of Anekantavada. So he stated, "If you will only permit a heathen to deliver the message of peace and love, I shall only ask you to look at the multifarious ideas presented to you in a liberal spirit, and not with superstition and bigotry, as the 7 blind men did in the elephant story. Brothers and sisters, I entreat you to hear the moral of the story and learn to examine the various religious systems from all standpoints." And so beyond merely stating the facts of historical instances where India was promoting tolerance or giving refuge to religious refugees, Gandhi points to the philosophical level, the story of the elephants, in which individual perspectives cannot give the full picture, but are relevant in their own right. But it requires a meta view which gives the correct place to all of these positions, which obviously can be applied to many contexts. And here it is the context about examining religious systems from all standpoints, and that also leading through a history of philosophical and metaphysical reflection in Jainism to what he claims a position that is open to interreligious dialogue. The story of the same event can thus be told differently if it is done from an Indian perspective. The point here is not to argue whether the US or India can lay claim to having invented dialogue and that openness to other religions, but that the Parliament of World Religions can, in this reading, be understood not as the starting point of interreligious dialogue, but as just one nodal point in a very long Indian history of interreligious engagement, which is what both Vivekananda and Gandhi are doing. They're contextualizing the event in which they're participating as part of Indian trajectories of engaging with religious plurality, and arguing at this stage back further, not just than this event, but maybe also then many of the ideas of Christianity because of the ancient nature of both Hinduism and Jainism. So they're connecting interreligious dialogue in a way back to what Vivekananda calls the oldest order of the monk order of the world. The reality is, of course, always more complex because we know, for example, that the term Hinduism, it was developed from a historical process. There are many very diverse traditions within Hinduism. But I still think the point is that these representatives at the parliament, they could make a lasting impression on their audience, including laying the claim that openness to dialogue is one of the defining features of the Indian traditions. Interreligious studies. Over recent years, interreligious studies has developed as an academic field that is growing and that it brings together the focus on interreligious dialogue and interreligious relations more widely. There have been a lot of recent publications, and the goal is to study how groups and individuals from different religions interact in formal and informal contexts. Often in that field, there is some overlap between participation in interreligious dialogue formats and the academic study of these practices in interreligious studies. So there is a lot of what we call scholar practitioners, and this has sometimes been called a strength and sometimes a weakness. When we look at the Wikipedia webpage on interreligious studies, which is not very good overall and maybe needs some revisions, that also lists the Parliament of the World Religions as the first event under its history section, which suggests, of course, that the Parliament is not only the beginning of interreligious dialogue, but also of interreligious studies. Publications in the field of interreligious studies include the Journal of Interreligious Studies, the Journal Interreligious Studies and Intercultural Theology. There exists an association for interreligious / interfaith studies, and a unit of the American Academy of Religion on interreligious interfaith studies, as well as the European Society for Intercultural Theology and Interreligious Studies. So these are just some examples of scholarly publications and organizations that are dedicated to studying relations between religions, both on individuals, on groups. It's an interdisciplinary field that brings together scholars from all kinds of fields to look at that phenomenon of interreligiosity. Maybe at this point also, I briefly point out interreligious and interfaith. There are a lot of different uses of terminology. Interreligious, I found that often is used more in the academic study when it's from a, say, social science or cultural science studies approach, while interfaith is often preferred more from an insider perspective. When there is a collaboration between people of different religions, they often use the word interfaith, but this is not universalizable. So many people use interreligious and interfaith exchangeably. And also the term interreligious dialogue, there are many different versions of that. Interreligious dialogue often is about the conscious engagement between people of different groups. For example, at dialogue meetings, we have interreligious relations that is often about more informal encounters. We have interreligious engagement that is often a stronger focus on action. But all of these fall into the broad field of what I call interreligious studies, or what could also be called interfaith studies. In my own country, Germany, interreligious studies and also interreligious dialogue is mainly about Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, maybe to some degree Buddhism. But I think that for the conceptual work and also just to do justice to what is happening in the world, interreligious studies, at least in my country, can benefit from an expansion and from considering the Indian vantage point, especially the Hindu traditions, both when it comes to a balanced understanding of global history and for reflecting the concepts that might be used meaningfully in interreligious studies. So as part of interreligious studies, there have also been developments about how we should think about the history of interreligious dialogue. I already mentioned that a lot of texts start by saying about the Parliament of World Religions as the main starting point of formal dialogue. And Marianne Moyart, who is one of the foremost scholars in interreligious studies, she has shown that modern interreligious dialogue developed through specific historical trajectories. And she explicitly states that the Parliament of the World Religions is overemphasized as the main big starting point for the study of interreligious dialogue. So she argues for a diversification, and she identifies several factors that came into play historically and reinforced each other. And the first factor often mentioned is the rise of modern interreligious dialogue, is the history of the European wars of religions in the 16th and 17th century. These wars showed the destructive force of religious conflict, and they helped to shape Enlightenment ideas of tolerance, human rights, and the separation of religion and state that are now often taken to be the normal in the European context. But that was a new development to think that people can choose their religion and then that religions can get in conversation with each other. The second factor is the ecumenical movement. That is the movement that encouraged Christians from different denominations to communicate and cooperate with each other. And this later extended as an attitude of openness to people of other religions. Another factor she mentioned was the collapse of colonialism after the Second World War, which weakened the belief that Western culture and religion were automatically superior. And people got into contact with other religions and noticed that they made similar claims, and there was no obvious argument anymore why the Western point should be the one that is that has the superiority. And another factor she mentioned was the horror of the Shoah, or the Holocaust, which took place in historical Christian Europe, and which at least partly drew on long-standing Christian anti-Jewish prejudice, and which showed that there needed to be a rethinking of how people from different religions relate to each other. In response to these four developments, many Christians of Europe and the United States began to see the need for more respectful ways of engaging other religions and promoting dialogue instead of focusing mainly on conversion. However, if we talk about diversifying the understanding of the history, then we might have to look a bit further, because all these factors that I listed so far, they came from European context, even if they had global effects, and they do not fully explain Hindu or Indian involvement in dialogue. So, for example, India had no role in the European wars of religion or in the Shoah, even though Indian soldiers they fought in European wars as part of the British Empire. But these conflicts were not shaped by Indian ideas or decisions. Then the Enlightenment was also a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it supported human rights and religious freedom, but on the other hand, it raised reason as an abstract value above all, and was often used to look down on those that were considered less rational, such as women or people of color. British colonial rule in India, for example, was often justified by the claim that Indians needed Western guidance and like as a civilizing mission. And the end of colonialism was partly the result of Indian and other colonized peoples standing up for them for their own ways of knowing and living as different and not inferior. And for this reason, the end of colonialism and Europe's wars of religion might have had a quite different psychological effect in Western and Indian contexts. And an Indian approach to interreligious dialogue cannot simply grow out of these European historical experiences. Moyat also mentions the ecumenical movement and the efforts to establish good relations between different Christian denominations. I think that is quite an interesting factor, because Asian voices in ecumenism can in a way function as a bridge between Western Christian histories and Indian approaches to interreligious relations, especially since many Indian churches and theological institutions develop within ecumenical structures. The modern ecumenical movement is often traced back to the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh 1910, which focused on practical cooperation between missionary agencies and avoided difficult discussions about church unity. Most participants of that conference came from Europe and North America, because the meeting was mainly about improving missionary work rather than listening to the voices of the so-called young churches, and that were, for example, the churches of Africa or Asia or the Pacific. Still, Asian participants argued that the denominational divisions imported from Europe, such as the Catholic Protestant lines or the different church groups, created unnecessary problems in Asian context and distracted from the message of the gospel. So Asian Christians were thus faced with a deep question: how can they understand themselves as Christians when their cultural ways of knowing are pushed aside by the Western agendas? And many Asian Christians questioned the idea that being a Christian meant a total break with the surrounding family and social history. So they didn't want to say that those around them believed something irrelevant, false, or outdated. In that sense, the attitude was much closer to many Indian or maybe Hindu traditions, where one's own practice and belief does not necessarily mean that one would claim that all others are wrong, but that different ways of being religious can coexist. Since the Western separation between religion and culture does not fit well in many Asian settings, the attempt to isolate Christianity from its environment created a discomfort and theological tension. And 20 years later, at the Tambaran conference in Madras, now Chennai, representatives from Asia and other non-Western regions were present in larger numbers. And there they made a strong case that clearly showed a cleavage between exclusive and more culturally open approaches. A visible result of this development was the creation of the Church of South India in 1947, shortly after Indian independence, that brought together Anglican, Congregational, Methodist, and Presbyterian traditions. And its symbol, a purple cross combined with a red and pink lotus, expresses visually that Christian faith can stand in continuity with Indian religious symbols shared with other traditions. So that may be also linking back to semiotization, as we had mentioned by Jan Assmann. The World Council of Churches, founded in 1948 and connected also to the Edinburgh process, became an important international space for these discussions. And within the World Council of Churches, theologians such as Linda Silver, Stanley Samata, and Wesley Aryaraja supported a vision that extended ecumenical cooperation towards interreligious dialogue and openness to religious plurality. And of these, Stanley Samata was from Karnataka and the other two from Sri Lanka. And at the time, there was a strong leaning towards pluralism. That means the idea that more than one religion can have the highest salvific value, that there's no hierarchy in the assessment of, say, Christianity or Hinduism. They're just seen as different approaches. Tension arose between this broader vision and more traditional church positions. And eventually the World Council of Churches shifted, what I would say, to focus on less controversial dialogue work. The question whether interreligious dialogue can be seen as a wider form of ecumenism is still debated. And some see natural continuity, while others clearly separate unity within Christianity from peaceful coexistence with other religions. But for many theologians from the majority world, extending ecumenism towards interreligious dialogue was a logical step, especially as the struggle for recognition of the cultures within Western theological frameworks. In this telling of history, interreligious dialogue grew less from missionary collaboration and more from the realization that Christianity and probably all religious traditions cannot be understood apart from local culture and from commitments to one's neighbor, as is also the title of one of the books by Wesley Aryaraja, Not Without My Neighbor. So even if we look at Christian ecumenism as one of the roots of interreligious dialogue, we see that the impulse towards dialogue within that movement also came from Asian and to a large degree South Asian Christians, in continuity with what might be called, for lack of a better word, Hindu culture. Now, this is just one expansion of one of the factors that Marianne Moyart mentioned, and there are many other connections that could be made equally to draw on. So, but here I can only provide a short outline of how we could move towards an expansion of a trajectory of how did interreligious dialogue develop through the perspective of Indian history. So long before 1893, the Indian subcontinent was marked by strong religious and philosophical diversity. Obviously, we have the Ashoka as one of the early examples, the site of interreligious dialogue at all. And in Indian interreligious dialogue will start probably also with the many darshanas that coexisted and debated in structured philosophical discussions known as the Shastrarata. So these debates followed logical rules and were intellectually serious, with traditions and intellectual lineages developing their positions in response to each other. And here, for example, if we talk about Mimamsa, Nyaya, Vedanta, and so on, it's not easy to say, should this now already call us interreligious dialogue? Is it philosophical dialogue? These categories, as I said, they don't map neatly because they're typically all considered as within Hinduism. But the mechanisms of debate and dialogue, they are pretty much established already at an early stage in Indian culture. And engagement through disagreement or partial agreement was normal across time in classical India. It was formal dialogue, but dialogue not focused on the promotion of tolerance, as it is often understood now, but with focus on the force of the stronger argument in the search for truth. Then, of course, we have a large number of lived encounters. For example, Jewish and Parsi communities that settled in India, as also mentioned in that short speech by Vivekananda. Thomas Christians were present long before the colonial missions in India, and actually before Europe became Christianized. So there was a form of Indian Christianity that we don't know much about, because much of that, what could give testimony, has been destroyed actually by Christians that arrived later during the colonial times. But from what we can say, they were very much enculturated and shared many practices with their Hindu, again as an anachronistic term, Hindu neighbors. And they lived together peacefully, maybe perceiving each other as different social groups rather than another religion. Indian traditions were, for the first time, made to engage very seriously with external religious claims through the advent of Islam. Islam came to India through various waves of conquest, and the relations were obviously marked by tension and difficulty or coercion, but also attraction and intellectual engagement, as Muslims entered into discussions with Hindu culture in many fields from art to science. In courtly context of the Mughals and beyond, both Hindu and Muslims interacted with the idea and knowledge systems of the other traditions. And scholar Annemarie Schimmel has pointed to the interreligious dynamics that were very complex with Islam in Hindu India. So she states that on the one hand, popular Islam was often almost blended with the practices of the Hindu neighbors. And on the other hand, there were reform movements that sought to defend the purity of Islamic monotheism, which in turn was seen by some mystics as parallel to Hindu monism. So we have interaction of the reform movements, interaction of Sufi and Bhakti spirituality. And these encounters were complex and sometimes conflictual. It's not about romanticizing the history of interreligious interaction in India, but they show that religious plurality was already part of social life before the West became a player on the scene. Then, of course, there was a chapter on the history of dialogue in Christianity, and here we can credit Mahatma Gandhi as one of the key global figures who promoted particular ideas of religious pluralism from an Indian center. That became widely influential, as he cited both the Gita and the Bible, but refused to pitch one against the other. And we have the influence on Western esotericism through the Theosophists that drew inspiration from Indian traditions. In more recent history, I just mentioned one person, Ebu Patel, who was born in India of Muslim heritage, and he started one of the biggest interfaith organizations, the Interfaith Youth Corps, now Interfaith America. So this broad sketch can already suggest that the history of interreligious dialogue can be told through an Indian story of engagement that involves Hindus, Jains, Buddhists, Indian Christians, and Muslims, and many other traditions that have their home on the Indian subcontinent. The appearance of Virchand Gandhi and Swami Vivekananda at the parliament can be fitted into the appropriate place in such a timeline of Indians doing dialogue, many long before there was a category of that name in the West. Conceptual implications I'm now turning to. Excuse me, Dr. Jain, how much longer should I speak? Sorry, I didn't take note of the time.
You can take your time, I think.
Okay.
How many minutes you need more?
Is it okay to talk for 5 to 10 minutes, or how long?
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
No problem.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't take note of the time before. Okay. So I'm now talking about the conceptual implications. So how would interreligious dialogue look from an vantage point? On the most fundamental level, I think if we center India, the categories of religion itself looks different. So the term interreligious studies has the word religious or religion in it, and talking about religions is really complicated in the Indian context. Indian traditions speak of Dharma, Darshana, or Sampradaya. They don't use for most of history the term religion or any concept that maps neatly onto that concept. So religion is not a concept separate from other forms of seeking spiritual or personal or philosophical progress. And we find more fluid and open boundaries towards, say, philosophical or wisdom dialogue. And the difficulty is to separate, or maybe it should not even be the task to separate these forms of dialogue. For example, when I did my dissertation on Jain Anikantavada, and I looked at the different connections, I never was sure, should I use philosophy or should I use religion? And to call it interreligious dialogue when Anikantavada is related to Buddhists, but when it is related to, for example, scientific discoveries, to call it something different, not dialogue anymore, that creates artificial distinctions that don't really make sense in the Indian context. And that can be the problem of the container. It's not the problem of the application or the object. Also, formal dialogue in India was more about strength of argument than about meet and greet, which is often today the rationale for dialogue meetings. This is because it was born out of competition for patronage among teachers and the desire to reach the truth in a very religiously diverse region, and not primarily developed to repair the fabric of a society after the civilizational traumas that Moyat identifies as the trajectories for the Western rise of dialogue. So also in India, we have these set rules for debates with catalogs of debate styles. And we might want to think more rhetorically about the forms of interreligious dialogues, like how could Indian categories of what makes good dialogue, how could they fit onto interreligious dialogue as a whole, but maybe to shift from the social repair aspect to that truth-seeking or rhetorical aspect. And also another point, in India, religion is less institutionalized, and the boundaries are more fluid, like, for example, when it comes to membership. So we are talking about smaller groups and lineages of teacher and student, rather than ism A and ism B. And this is a conversation that I often had in Fiji with a colleague, that when it comes to India, a traditions approach might in many ways make more sense than a religions approach, because the category religion suggests solid walls, but in the Indian context, we have a lot of shared civilizational heritage, for example, among Jains, Hindus, and Buddhists. And at the same time, we have a lot of inner plurality. So that talking about interreligious dialogue can give a false sense of security, of knowing what we're talking about. And the differentiation of the big label interreligious is something that I'm working on currently, to think that sometimes religion and being a Hindu, being a Buddhist, being a Christian, being a Jain might not be the most significant level for talking about plurality or homogeneity. And I think that when we consider the complexity of Indian identities, or simply the fact that religious identity works different in India, that can help to rethink questions of plurality and dialogue, and what dialogue is meant to mean in the first place. And another point is that religion in India is less individualistic than in the West. So we can learn about different ways of how religious identity connects to other forms of identity, and how these might have to be taken into account when we look at interreligious relations, and for which we must never forget that there are not relations between religions. There are always relations between people. So how do we have to think about people, and what role religion, even the term religion being problematic, plays in their life? How is that integrated into a holistic understanding of the human being? Then religion is often less text-based and dogmatic, and more about what people do. Like dialogue is often more a lived pluralism in the Indian context. And the very concept of religion was, of course, taken from Christianity, like a book, a founder, a creed, and so on. And then matches were sought within other traditions. But Hinduism, for example, doesn't work like that. It has a much stronger emphasis on bodily practices, for example. So an Indian vantage point can teach us that textual forms of dialogue should not be centered as the object of study, and that when textual approaches are centered as natural, this is a choice often by Christian initiators, to whom it is natural to quote from the Bible, and to invite their dialogue partners to quote from their sacred texts. So I would say that the Indian context, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and also Indian Christianity and Islam, can give scholars of interreligious studies the necessary distance to view established dialogue practice as historically contingent. And these are just some initial starting points that I present in this presentation, as it's very much in progress. But yeah, there are many questions, I think, that can be asked, and many very exciting topics that can be studied from that. I'm part of a network called the Network of Hinduism in Dialogue, and we will have actually an online meeting on that very soon, where I'm not the expert on this topic. I am basically part of a group that invites scholars from India and beyond to reflect on that. What words should be used for dialogue in the Hindu traditions? How is dialogue presented in Hindu texts? What are contemporary forms of dialogue? Thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this really insightful, enlightening talk. Very relevant, and we really need to have these thoughts and similar ideas, I think, everywhere, more and more needed, I think. So thank you so much for choosing such an important topic and such an important point. I kept thinking, as you quoted Swami Vivekananda, and how he listed so many other examples of Jews coming to India and living happily ever after, Christians coming to India, living happily ever after for 2 millennia, both these communities. So Jews, Christians, then Muslims also came to India over a millennia ago, just when Prophet Muhammad was still living. The first mosque was already built in Kerala. So Jews, Christians, Muslims. Then Zoroastrians also came almost a millennia ago in Gujarat and lived happily ever after. These four groups came, these four groups that did not start in India, but as they came to India and as they kept living here and even participated in nation building in India, and especially Zoroastrians, and how they are now integral part of Indian business and economy, especially Tata Group, which is synonymous with Indian economy today. Yeah, so many. But I still but on the other hand, I also was thinking that now, especially Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and Zoroastrian, all four, have been in India for almost a millennium or more, 2 millennia for Jews and Christians, and yet we tend to feel some tension even within India. It's not like you said, we don't want to romanticize, and we know that there are tension also within India. But what is the issue that even though, like you also referred many times, Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists have been living in India for more than 2 millennia, but they seem to be much more tightly integrated, and a lot of intertwining, a lot of overlaps happening. But Christians and all Christian, Muslim, Jews, and Zoroastrians, they have also been living in India for over 1,000 years or 2,000 years. Yet that integration within Indian traditions is not as smooth and easy as it is among Hindu, Buddhists. So, there is no easy answer to this. We all have to keep thinking. I'm not asking you a question. I'm just thinking aloud with you, and you can keep thinking. I can keep thinking. And if I may also, think aloud with you, and maybe think of this reason for this tension within India also still there. It seems like that since Hindus, Jains, Buddhists, and Sikh, we didn't mention Sikhism, these four that started in India, it seems like they are more attuned to Indian ecology. Sustainability is part of a reason, so I'm bringing in some nature also. It seems like these four have so much to connect to India. Wherever I go in India, I've been living in India for now last 5 years. Before that, I was in the US. But now that wherever I go in India, this is where Rama lived. This is where Pandavas lived. This is where Hanumanji lifted the mountain. This is where this. So all these. This is where Buddha lived. This is where Mahavir lived. This is where Guru Nanak lived. So all those connections to the native land and its native ecology, water bodies and trees and mountains and animals are so integral to these four. But the ones that came from outside, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Zoroastrianism, they seem to still lack that indigenous connection to indigenous ecology. That could be one reason why they still look outside India for their inspiration. Obviously, Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem and Vatican City and on and on. I don't know if that's the reason, and what can make these 8 traditions now, 4 that started in India, 4 that started outside India but came to India, these 8 traditions within India, how can they become even more harmonious and really present an excellent, ideal role model to the world? And you very correctly pointed out that it is not that Parliament of World Religion is not the starting point for interreligious dialogue. It happened in India centuries and centuries ago, as the Jews came, Christians came. So all these thoughts are in my mind very fresh, and thanks for igniting my mind with all these thoughts. You want to say something on what all I said?
Yes. Yeah, you were mentioning about the ecology, and in dialogue meetings, I find that this is something where people actually can come together. Obviously, Christianity, since Pope Francis has also learned a lot of things that traditions in India know much longer about the interconnectedness of our life and so on. But I think traditions from outside India, they are catching up, and people are very keen all over the world to how do we care for the world together. And maybe we just have one planet altogether. So maybe I found that this is one of the fruitful ways of trying to engage together. So in all dialogue meetings that I've attended, people are very keen to engage on environmental topics. And maybe this is a direction of hope, where land and nature and plants, they are seen not as like connected to one religion or to one country, but as a shared home and the interconnectedness of all. But you are right in all the issues. It's a complex issue. It's not saying one or the other. And belonging and identity, these are complex, and there are tensions. Yes.
Oh, we do have one participant, Professor Namrata Rathod. I don't know if she has any question. I think she's in Varanasi, one of the holiest towns for Hindus and Jains.
Yes, sir. Yes, Professor
Yes.
Pankaj.
Most welcome. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was a really very interesting session, and love to listen in. And recently about this question of the Orthodox Christians, the Nasranis as they are called in Kerala. So, like I was just visiting, not an academic visit, a personal visit. And I came upon these two forms of dance that they have. One is a dance of the Syrian Christians, and what amazed me was that just as there are so many Kerala dances among the Hindus, like ceremonial performances, so to say, so the Nasranis also have these Margam Kadipattus and another dance form. The name, slips me at the moment. And when we look at these, so although the text goes on, to talk about the ancient St. Thomas Christians and all, but it's so much entrenched in the like environment of Kerala, like the natural environment of Kerala, and nowhere else. Like I may be like ill-informed, but I have not come across Christian dances like which are performed, ritually during some Christian festivals. So in this way, and also this tying of the minnu, this tali that when Indian women get married, so they have this Mangal Sutra and like that. So we find this also among the Nasranis, that is the St. Thomas Christians, and also the Jews in Kerala. Somewhere we do find, some integration. But yes, this is so interesting and so engaging. We definitely will find more if we dig further. Thank you
Yes,
so much.
yes. That's an
May I
important topic.
respond
Yes,
briefly?
please, please.
Yes, thank you very much for mentioning dance, because at the very end of my presentation, I showed about a symposium that we will organize. And when we sent out the call for papers, I was amazed that quite a lot of submissions, they were actually on aesthetics, specifically on dance as a form of dialogue. So I think this is something else that we can learn from India, that it does not have to be just about texts, but as said before, the environment, nature, dance, movement, and beauty, these can be forms of dialogue. Maybe that can sometimes work better than intellectual, when it's so difficult sometimes to bridge differences. Well, thank you so much for pointing out these examples of how Christianity enculturated in India and took on something that maybe it is lacking elsewhere, the dance aspect.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
And Professor Rathod's comment reminded me of a PBS documentary that came in the US Public Broadcasting Services. PBS is nationwide network in the US. It was an 8-minute report from India, Kerala, where they were showing that Christians have been living in India for millennia, and they proudly called themselves Christian by religion, Hindu by culture, and Indian by citizenship. Proudly saying, Christian priests were saying it proudly. And just as Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists do arti in their mandirs and in their place of worship, the Christian priests were also doing these arti to Jesus Christ. So that's again a give and take, as they've been living in India for so long, for 2 millennia, like we know. But what happened after, what he said after that, he mentioned all this, and then he said, first time these St. Thomas Christians were persecuted in India was when European Christians came to India.
Yes.
Before that, for 1500 years, Christians lived happily ever after in Kerala, in India. But first time when fellow Christians came from Europe, Portugal, and other places, Catholics and so on, that was the time when Christians were persecuted. So this is just a radical difference between, like Professor Barbato so excellently demonstrated, that in India, this is very easy to accept that everybody's moving towards the same goal, different paths. Paths could be different, ways could be different, goal is same. But that's so difficult for exclusivistic religious ideologies of religion that started outside India, which is what causes probably this tension. And so these are the ideas that we have to keep thinking, keep developing. So thank you again for this wonderful topic. And if you want to say something more, most welcome.
Yeah, I would say thank you for inviting me. And yes, it was very good to hear the reflection. And I also would like to thank very much our participant for the question. And it's wonderful to be with you.
And most welcome in Flame University, Pune, India, whenever you happen to come. Professor Rathod, you too. and Professor Barbato, you both are most welcome
Thank you so much.
to visit us
Thank you.
in
Yeah.
Pune. Thank
Thank
you
you,
again.
Professor Rathod.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
That-
Professor Jain.
Thank
Thank
you.
Bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.